Greetings everyone, this is Danny Pang, and today I'm going to be reacting to The History of Croatia by Suibhne. The reason I'm suddenly so interested in about Croatia is because I've been watching this travel documentary about two guys traveling to Croatia, in modern days of course, and it's a beautiful country, so naturally I want to learn more about its history, so let's start.
The Samurai Limited Edition pin is available now. Hurry and order yours now before they run out. Or get one for free by signing up at Patreon like all of these nice people. This episode is supported by CuriosityStream. Sign up today and get access to Nebula, a streaming platform for creators by creators. To study the Balkans is to study nation building. The term Balkanization was tossed around a lot during the Yugoslav Wars, which was a culmination of ethnic tensions leading to the independence of Croatia from the control of Belgrade in 1991. But nations do not spring up overnight. It takes decades, centuries, and sometimes longer to convince a group of people to split from another. And the Balkans is where this phenomenon is most manifest in Europe. Going back as far as the Roman Empire, the Balkans were a crossroads, divided between the Latin West and the Greek East half of the empire, and influenced by two separate branches of Christianity. The roots of nationalism and ethnic romanticism could be determined by which side of this line you found yourself, even when the area was settled by Slavic migrants during the Great Migration period. Pushed by invading hordes of Avars and Bulgars, the Slavs entered Byzantine Dalmatia, along with the arrival of the Hungarians, who pushed the Illyrians east of the Carpathian Mountains in perhaps the coolest game of dominoes in human history. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Though not a nation yet, the Croats were part of the southern Slavic settlements, and soon a duchy within Byzantium, and then subjugated by the Franks, which really puts into perspective just how big the Frankish Empire was. It was...
Who are the Franks? Never heard of them. Are they the ancestors of France? Don't know.
Around this time that one of the nation-building factors would begin to influence Croatia's future. Remember those two churches we talked about in the intro? Well, they're about to go through a pretty nasty divorce in 1054. Croatia was firmly within the Latin sphere, and so naturally they became part of the Catholic faith, while the rest of the Balkans under Byzantium became Orthodox Christians led by Constantinople, which was a far better deal in my opinion because they also got this fancy new alphabet thrown in for free. Croatia would keep the Latin alphabet. So if you're taking notes on silly reasons for people to Balkanize, then this should be right at the top. Croatia eventually became a constituent kingdom in 925, before soon breaking away completely from Frankish control. See? That's a heck of a lot older than 1991.
True.
One of their kings, Stephen I, is said to have been captured by a Venetian and played him in a game of chess to win his freedom, which is just one of the many legends on the origin of the Croatian coat of arms. And also my personal favorite, by the way. So what? I like Venetians, okay? The Trpimirović dynasty ruled Croatia until the death of King Stephen II, as many dynasties do, because he had no male heir, leading to the larger and more populous Kingdom of Hungary to inherit the territory. Rule from Hungary turned out to be a pretty sweet gig as it introduced feudalism to Croatia, which benefited the 12 noble tribes that ruled the various counties with local autonomy. Although just a constituent kingdom, Croatia was actually ruled by a ban, a type of royal viceroy within the Hungarian crown over everything except for Dalmatia. The Dalmatian city-states were made up of Romanized refugees who fled to the coast from the Slavs centuries earlier and set up their own independent territories that thrived on trade with Italy, enjoying protection by the Byzantines. They even spoke a Romance language called Dalmatico, which was somewhat mutually intelligible with many Italian dialects, so if you ever heard somebody say that Dalmatia once spoke Italian, that's probably what they mean by that. Of these cities, one was to come to particular prominence, the Republic of Ragusa. Roman refugees fled the city of Epideurum and settled on a small island which they called Lausa, right across the bank from a Croatian settlement which they named Dubrovnik.
By the way, I have no idea. I've never heard of like 90% of what he just spoke about, like the names, places names, people's names. I have never heard of any of them. So this is all brand new learning experience for me, which I like. But I'm probably gonna need to watch this like 4 or 5 times to actually absorb anything from it. So that's what I'll be doing in the future after the first time this time.
The two sides put apart their differences and eventually joined into one city, which they renamed Ragusa, while Dubrovnik became the Croatian name for the city. They were allowed to govern themselves under the Byzantine Empire and, funnily enough, also briefly the Normans, which, like, I don't really know what the Normans were even doing there, so far away from home in the first place. But anyway, these cities flourished enough in the Adriatic that they managed to get the attention of Venice. The Venetians were merchants, and if there's one thing a merchant hates, it's competition. So they came up with a clever plan. Manipulate the armies of the Fourth Crusade to sack the city of Zara, one of their rivals, then move on to Constantinople and sack them, collapse the Byzantine Empire, and take all those lovely Dalmatian cities for themselves.
Dalmatians. Does it have anything to do with the dotted docks?
What could possibly go wrong? And just like that, Ragusa, like much of the Adriatic, found itself under new management. Back in Croatia, the Arpad dynasty passed on to the Angevin dynasty. You know, that family that once ruled England. But the political situation in the Balkans was about to drastically change with the rump state of the Byzantine Empire collapsing on all sides, due to a brand new threat from Anatolia, the Ottoman Turks. But before we start that, it's worth pausing here to talk about Bosnia, which is a sentence I'd never thought I'd have to say out loud. Once a banate within the Hungarian crown centered on the Bosna River, in 1377 it became an independent kingdom. As a state sandwiched between Serbia and Croatia, Bosnia was heavily influenced by Catholic Croats and Orthodox Serbs. The lines in Bosnia were blurred perhaps more than anywhere else in the Balkans. And for many centuries, a third, separate church, the Bosnian Church, held great sway over the land, considered heretical by both the Catholics and the Orthodox. So just keep these guys in mind as we move forward. Right, back to the Ottoman Turks. Just mentioning the Ottomans by name in the Balkans will create all sorts of animosity. Croats, Serbs, Bulgarians and Greeks disagree on almost everything, but one thing they are united on is their less than favorable feelings on the Ottomans, and not for unfounded reason. And with the fall of Constantinople,
of course, people would fight amongst themselves within a certain place until they have a common enemy from the outside. So that's obviously the case here.
They conquered the Balkan kingdoms one by one, until they were right on Croatia's doorstep. The Croats fought bravely to defend their kingdom, but were soundly defeated in 1493 and again in 1526, the latter of which saw the death of King Louis II, and so the crown of Hungary had to turn to their north for help. Hungary and Croatia elected Ferdinand I of the House of Habsburg as their king. It was not known yet, but this decision would lay some of the deepest roots of division in the Balkans over the next few centuries, as the Habsburgs and the Ottomans became fierce enemies. Now here's a little lesson in empire building from the Ottomans. Military force only gets you so far. For real longevity, what you need is allies. The Ottomans, who had found themselves now ruling a vast territory of Orthodox Christians, gave certain privileges and offices to these new subjects, who had historically been mistreated by Catholics and Crusaders, turning their opinion against the Habsburgs and their brutal counter-reformation. We're not your enemy, they're your enemy. Just look at how they treat Protestants. In addition, introducing Islam to marginalized populations like members of the Bosnian Church and Albanians, providing them with better opportunities in Ottoman society. Cutting a really long story short here, the Habsburgs and their allies halted the Ottoman advance into Europe, most notably repelling the Ottoman armies at the Siege of Vienna in 1529 and again in 1683. And after the Battle of Slankamen, almost all of Croatia was returned to the Habsburgs. And so began the gradual decline of the Ottomans and the rise of the Habsburgs in the Balkan region. Croatian lands were designated as the military frontier against Turkish incursions. But things weren't all bad for them. The age of the Habsburgs saw a brief revival in Croatian prosperity, thanks in part to being treated favourably by Maria Theresa, whom they had supported during the Austrian succession crisis. The final piece of Croatia's Habsburg story would not come until the Napoleonic Wars, when Venice was defeated by the French, in which the Dalmatian coast was finally unified again with the rest of the country under the empire. Because, let's face it, you can't have Croatia without Dalmatia. And, just like that, all of Croatia was under Habsburg rule. And Habsburg rule was about to get messy. Nationalism was spreading through Europe like wildfire. People started thinking of themselves as nations. A common people, a common language with common history, you get the drill. Croatia was swept up in Croatian nationalism, and even more broadly, Pan-Slavic or Yugoslav nationalism, as Slavic nations in the Ottoman Empire began revolts against the Turks. After the revolutions of 1848 and the disastrous Austro-Prussian War, the Habsburg Empire was transformed into a dual monarchy, elevating the Hungarian half as equal partners. But this failed to answer the Croatian question, as it only weakened their sovereignty, and tensions began rising. And when the Russo-Turkish Wars had resulted in many Slavic nations winning their independence from the Turks, Austrians added fuel to the fire by occupying and later annexing Bosnia. Yugoslav nationalists, outraged that they had traded one empire for another, began to be radicalized. The relatively weaker Balkan states had to look somewhere else for land for the time being, and so began the Balkan Wars. The Balkan Wars will definitely be covered in a separate video, but the main takeaway here is that no one, absolutely nobody, was happy with the outcome of the Balkan Wars. Not the Bulgarians.
Who's ever happy about any wars?
Not the Greeks, certainly not the Turks and the Austrians, but least of all, Yugoslav nationalists. It is not surprising then that a new war would soon erupt in this region. A young terrorist Yugoslav group called Young Bosnia, supported by the Serbian secret society, the Black Hand, would assassinate Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914. The first...
Isn't the Black Hand an Italian mafia organization? Is it the same Black Hand? I don't know.
World War had begun. That ultranationalism was only going to grow in Croatia during the war. They saw the writing on the wall when Austria-Hungary began to collapse in 1918. With the war drawing to a close, the state of Slovenes, Croats and Serbs declared their independence from the Habsburg Empire in Zagreb, soon to join with Serbia and Montenegro to form the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Serbs, Croats, Bosnians and Slovenes were brothers after all, separated it seemed only by politics. Serbo-Croatian was even made the chief language of the kingdom, spoken in local varieties by a massive majority of Yugoslavs, even if it was written in two separate alphabets. But much like actual friends who become roommates in college, the Serbs, Croats, Slovenes and others soon found that living in the same house together was a tad more difficult than expected. The Croats on one hand favoured local autonomy, while the Serbian government in Belgrade favoured more centralised control, which led to Croats being heavily mistreated in the kingdom, being seen as a threat to Yugoslav nationalism, and even as separatists. Now take all this with a pinch of salt, it was the age of propaganda after all, but suffice it to say that the Croats weren't too happy with the Serbian government. And they had reason to be, especially when the Yugoslav king transformed the country into a dictatorship after the assassination of Croatian leader Stjepan Radic in 1929. It was beginning to feel like joining Yugoslavia was more of a shackle than a liberation for Croatia. And you'd be forgiven for agreeing with them, but this story doesn't have a happy ending. The situation in Croatia was a breeding ground for extremists. Many of them lurched to the right and created the Ustashi, a fascist party and terrorist group. It was these Ustashi that the Nazis would target as collaborators to their regime. 2 years into the Second World War, after a pro-Western coup d'etat overthrew the Yugoslav government, Germany, Italy, and the other Axis powers invaded and annexed Yugoslavia. The Germans set up the puppet state of independent Croatia, placing the Ustashi in power. The fascist Ustashi committed numerous atrocities under Ante Pavelic, including genocide against Serbs, Jews, and Roma, and ran the infamous Jasenovac concentration camp. Many resistant groups were created in opposition to the Axis, but the most successful by far was the Yugoslav Partisans, a socialist and Yugoslav nationalist volunteer force led by one Josip Broz Tito. They led a successful guerrilla campaign against the occupying Axis forces as well as the Ustashi, and when the war was coming to an end, the partisans went on a brutal campaign against the captured Ustashi and Axis soldiers that resulted in the massacre of thousands of perceived enemies, guilty or otherwise. The wartime chapter of Yugoslavia doesn't get as much attention outside of the former Yugoslav countries as it probably should, but the devastation that was wrought on the country, both internally and externally, is vital to understanding the post-war story of Croatia. Josip Broz Tito, as it turns out, was the glue that would be needed to keep Yugoslavia together, as there was nothing but bad blood after the war. Tito was an idealist, a socialist, a national hero, and a symbol of united brotherhood, himself being half Croat and half Slovene, and an advocate for the famous Third Way stance during the Cold War. But peace would die with Tito in 1980. Nationalism and self-determination fueled by decades of resentment and hatred, coupled with a massive downturn in the economy, Yugoslavia was breathing its last breath. I've been planting seeds throughout this video about what ultimately led to Balkanization, the division of the West and the Eastern Empire, the great schism between Catholics and Orthodoxy, the atrocities of the Crusades on Orthodox Christians, the union with the Habsburgs versus the annexation by the Ottomans, the introduction of Islam and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, fascists supported by the Axis in Croatia, partisans supported by the USSR. And right at the top of that list, the writing system, Cyrillic used by one brother and Latin by another for the same language. The division of the Balkans goes back centuries, and Yugoslavia was just too different, too entrenched, too suspicious, and too dogmatic to stay together. Centuries of pulling the same people apart could not be solved in the less than 100 years of Yugoslavia's existence. The Yugoslav wars are a relatively recent tragedy, the only major war on European soil since the fall of Berlin in 1945. Made vastly more complicated because the territory comprising of the Yugoslav Croatia also had a large minority of Serbs who started uprisings to break away from Croatian control. Ethnic and religious lines don't always follow the national boundaries. When writing this, I didn't really know how to conclude this video other than to just take a moment and reflect on that fact. Croatia and its people have won their independence, and you'd be hard-pressed to argue that that's a bad thing. But the road there came with oppression, war, dominance by foreign powers of every variety, and stained with untold blood. The interesting philosophical debate on how these things could have been different. If Rome hadn't divided, if the churches hadn't split, if the Ottomans had won at the Siege of Vienna. These are all interesting things for me to wonder. And it is in that vein that I'd like to share something with you. One of the most amazing series I've had the pleasure of breathtaking art.
Well, anyway, that seems like to be the end of the that video. A lot of new information for me. I had zero background knowledge about this place, and now I have I'm even more confused than before I watched this video. A lot of new names of places and race, and many different changes of the race and languages for me, so I do really need to watch this a few more times. But basically, I think from my main takeaway from this video is that Croatia has been a land of conflicts between races and religions and languages, etc., etc. But at the end, they've won their freedom from everyone else, became an independent country. Yep, that's what I got from that video for now. Very informative. I really love the animations and the designs of characters from Suibhne. So that's the end of that, and I've got to watch this video a few more times now, so I'll see you in the next video.